The glitch in the system. Mark Ashton's daybreak ritual was a grim sacrament: tepid coffee from yesterday's grounds, a flimsy bagel scarfed down before the tyrannical cursor, and a sigh battling the knot of preemptive frustration in his chest. This morning's exhalation tangled with the tinny drone of news from his laptop. Something about strange sightings by the docks. Mark scoffed. Another viral fabrication, costumed pranksters. Undoubtedly. He killed the audio hype. The planet was drowning in it. Give him elegant code. So UND architecture, something tangible. That was the focus needed. Project Chimera, his passion project. Or rather, his unruly, bug-infested creation threatening to sabotage his career. Mark plunged back into the code labyrinth, lines blurred, an indecipherable script taunting his supposed mastery. He'd been hunting this particular gremlin for 72 hours straight, fueled by caffeine, sustained by instant noodles, nurtured by the creeping dread that the cosmos itself was plotting against him. The console spat out, segmentation fault, core dumped, obscure and infuriating. He reran the debugger, meticulously charting the execution flow, scrutinizing each variable, each function call. He muttered, a jumble of programming terms punctuated by the occasional curse word. That it had to be a flaw in reasoning, that a missing character, a wild pointer, a flawed algorithm. The solution was there, buried beneath layers of complexity, begging to be unearthed. He stretched, his spine protesting. The apartment resembled a biohazard zone. Pizza cartons formed leaning towers on the coffee table, clothes littered the floor like battlefield debris, and the air reeked of despair and old coffee. He wasn't wired for domesticity. He was designed for this, for conquering impossible challenges, for grappling with the intricacies of the digital realm, for sculpting silicon to his will. Another hour evaporated. He tried a new tactic, rewriting a core routine from the ground up, hoping to banish the phantom haunting his program. Useless. The glitch remained, an insidious whisper in the machine. He slammed a fist on the desk, sending tremors through his coffee mug. He needed respite. Reluctantly, he detached himself from the screen and ambled to the window. The cityscape spread below, a concrete jungle teeming with purpose. Or a facsimile of it, people hurrying to their jobs, ignorant of the intricate frameworks upholding their everyday lives, frameworks that he, in his own limited way, helped to construct and uphold. His eyes snagged on a news ticker scrolling across a neighbor's television. Unsettling figure reports continue to surge on social media. He sighed. Even Mrs. Henderson, usually consumed by soap operas, was captivated by this ridiculous sideshow. He pivoted from the window, dismissing the outside world as an absurd, irrational mess. The only reality that held meaning was the one he could command, the one he could analyze, the one he could fix. He returned to his station, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. The system imperfection beckoned, and Mark Ashton, armed with logic and caffeine, was ready for battle. The first smile. The cursor blinked mockingly on the screen. Another error message. Mark slammed his fist on the desk, the cheap plastic protesting with a brittle creak. Hours wrestling with this rogue piece of code, and it was still winning. He scrubbed a hand over his tired eyes, the grit of exhaustion a familiar comfort. Right, he muttered to the empty office, fresh air it is. The night was a damp blanket, clinging to him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Streetlights cast a sickly yellow glow, painting the puddles with an oily sheen. Usually, the walk home calmed him, the rhythm of his steps a metronome against the day's anxieties. Tonight, though, the frustration still simmered. He turned the corner onto Elm Street, his usual route, and that's when he saw it. Or rather, him. A figure stood motionless beneath the flickering streetlight, silhouetted against the darkness. Nothing unusual about that. People waited for buses, made late-night calls, all sorts of things, but as Mark drew closer, a disturbing detail emerged. The man's face. It was tilted upwards, catching the full glare of the streetlight, illuminating a smile stretched to an impossible width. Not a pleasant smile, not a happy smile, but a grotesque, exaggerated rictus that seemed to pull the skin taut across his skull. It looked painted on. Mark slowed his pace, a knot forming in his stomach. The smile didn't waver, didn't flicker, didn't do anything a normal smile should. It was fixed, frozen, alien. He risked a glance at the man's eyes. They were wide, unfocused, staring straight ahead. He was a good 20 feet away now, close enough to discern the man's clothes, a dark, nondescript overcoat, the kind anyone might wear. "Hey," Mark called out, his voice wavering slightly. "You okay?" The figure didn't react. Didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't acknowledge him in any way. The smile remained, a horrifying punctuation mark on a silent, still face. Mark picked up his pace, walking faster, then faster still, practically jogging past the man that he kept his eyes straight ahead, refusing to look back. The image of that stretched, unnatural smile seared into his brain that he didn't stop running until he reached his front door, fumbling with his keys, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Safe. Inside, he leaned against the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Okay," he said aloud, trying to force a sense of normalcy into the room. "Okay, that was weird. Maybe it was a prank, some idiot trying to be edgy, scaring people on the street, kids these days. Or maybe the guy was just mentally ill, lost in his own world. That terrible smile a symptom of something deeply wrong. Yeah, that had to be it." But even as he told himself this, a sliver of doubt wormed its way into his mind, the sheer unnaturalness of it, the eyes, the stillness that it felt wrong, profoundly, fundamentally wrong. That he glanced out the window, the curtains slightly parted. Elm Street lay silent and empty under the yellow glow. That he pulled the curtains shut, but the image of that smile lingered, a phantom imprint on the back of his eyelids. That he had to get back to work, distract himself with the damn code. Maybe a few hours staring at the screen would erase the image. But as he walked toward his computer, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something small, something almost imperceptible. A seed of unease had been planted, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would be seeing that smile again. They're getting closer. The bug mocked him, lines of code, shimmering on the screen, resolutely refused to cooperate. Mark slammed his fist on the desk, the cheap wood groaning in protest. 3 days. 3 days he'd been chasing this phantom, fueled by lukewarm coffee and dwindling hope. He needed air. He grabbed his jacket, the chill October air biting at his exposed skin as he stepped outside. The usual streetlights cast pools of orange on the damp pavement, highlighting the slick sheen of fallen leaves. But something was different. Across the street, near the bus stop, one stood, not like last time, a lone figure lurking in the distance. This one was closer, maybe 50 feet away. The smile was unmistakable, a jagged, impossibly wide curve etched onto their face. They stood motionless, silhouetted against the flickering neon sign of the late-night laundromat. Mark's breath hitched. He started walking, forcing himself to maintain a casual pace, his eyes darting around. Another one. Further down the block, leaning against a lamppost, the grotesque grin gleaming in the artificial light. This one was facing him, head cocked slightly, an unnerving parody of curiosity. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs. He risked a glance behind him. The first one was gone, but the second one was moving, slowly, deliberately, matching his speed. He broke into a run, adrenaline surging through him. He reached his building, fumbled with his keys, and practically threw himself inside, slamming the door shut behind him. Leaning against the cold metal, he gasped for air. The image of that frozen, smiling face burned into his mind. Upstairs, safe, or at least safer, behind locked doors. He booted up his laptop. He needed answers. He typed "strange smiling people sightings" into the search bar, half expecting nothing, half dreading what he might find. The results were a chaotic mess of conspiracy theories, urban legends, and forum threads filled with blurry photos and unsubstantiated claims. The smiling man, the grinner's smile epidemic. The names varied, but the descriptions were chillingly consistent. Figures with unnaturally wide smiles, standing motionless, staring. He scrolled through the threads, a growing unease settling in his stomach. Most of the posts were dismissed as elaborate hoaxes or mass hysteria. Pareidolia, one commenter wrote, people seeing what they want to see. Another claimed it was a government experiment gone wrong. Mark wanted to believe it was all nonsense, a collective delusion fueled by the internet, but the faces he saw, the faces were real. He clicked on a grainy photo, supposedly taken in Prague, the subject eerily similar to the ones he'd seen. The comments were filled with speculation, fear, and denial. He closed the laptop, the blue light reflecting in his wide, sleepless eyes. He knew what he saw. He couldn't dismiss it. He stared out the window, the city lights blurring into a hazy glow. They were getting closer, and he had a feeling they wouldn't stop until they reached his door. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that even now, in the darkness, those impossibly wide smiles were fixed on him, eyes on the unseen. The bug was a hydra. Mark killed one process, 2 more sprang up in its place that he'd been wrestling with it for 18 hours straight, the glow of the monitor painting his face a sickly blue that he rubbed his eyes, gritty with fatigue, and leaned back in his chair, cracking his neck. Maybe a quick walk would clear his head that he pushed himself up and stumbled towards the window, pulling back the cheap blinds that a jolt of pure, icy terror slammed into him. 3 of them, standing silently on the sidewalk. Across the street, illuminated by the orange sodium glow of the streetlights, their smiles, impossibly wide, seemed to stretch the limits of human anatomy. He didn't recognize them, not like the man who vaguely resembled his old accountant, the one he'd seen a few nights ago. These were strangers. He recoiled, heart hammering against his ribs. They hadn't been there a minute ago, had they? He must be hallucinating from sleep deprivation. He blinked rapidly, focusing on a discarded pizza box tumbling down the street. Anything to break the spell. He looked again. They were still there, unmoving, watching. He slammed the blinds shut, a wave of nausea washing over him. Screw the bug. He wasn't dealing with this tonight. He needed sleep. He needed something. The next morning, fortified by lukewarm coffee and sheer stubbornness, Mark had a plan. He couldn't deny what he was seeing. Not anymore. He went online and ordered 3 high-definition security cameras. He installed them that afternoon, one facing the street, one covering the side yard, and another trained on the back alley. That night, he couldn't work. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves, sent a shiver down his spine. He found himself compulsively checking the monitor, cycling through the camera feeds. Nothing, just empty streets, swaying branches, the mundane darkness of suburbia. Finally, exhaustion won. He set the cameras to record on motion detection and collapsed into bed. He woke early, the lingering anxiety of the previous night clinging to him. He went straight to his computer, pulling up the security footage. The first few hours were uneventful, a stray cat, a garbage truck rumbling down the street. Then, around 3:17 a.m., the street camera flickered to life. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, the Smilers. Mark leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. He watched them standing there, perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity. Then, something shifted. When he was actively watching the live feed, they were static, lifeless. But the recorded footage revealed a subtle, horrifying truth. Their heads tilted in unison, almost imperceptibly, like flowers following the sun. Their smiles widened, becoming even more grotesque, exposing rows of teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp, and their eyes darted back and forth, not with human awareness, but with a strange, jerky, insectal movement. Mark rewound the footage, watching it again and again. It was undeniable. When he wasn't directly observing them, they weren't still, they were observing. Studying their surroundings, planning. He felt a cold dread creep into his bones. He wasn't just seeing things. He was being seen, and whatever they were getting ready to do something. Familiar faces. The glitch in the security system's code was a stubborn adversary. Mark, eyes burning, stared into the monitor's radiant hues of blue and green. Hours bled into one another, the taste of stale coffee bitter on his tongue, fueled only by the creeping unease that had taken root deep within. Just a minor adjustment to the loop, a coaxing of the algorithm to acknowledge the errant timestamp. If he could achieve that, perhaps he'd salvage a fragment of genuine footage, something other than the spectral forms that plagued his waking thoughts. Then, a flicker of triumph. A corrected sequence bloomed in the debugger. Mark paused, breath caught, replaying the previous night's recordings, fixating on the porch camera. Nothing but snow. Then, a shape coalesced out of the static stance, tall, emaciated, unnervingly still. And then, the curve of a smile. Mark gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound. He reversed the footage, watched it loop endlessly. The picture, though poor, the details blurred by digital compression, couldn't mask the familiar bearing, the tilt of the head, even the glint of light on thinning, gray strands. He recognized that silhouette. It was imprinted on his mind. It was Mrs. Gable. A sickening wave rolled through him. Mrs. Gable, 2 doors away, the perpetually apologetic woman who plied him with homemade cookies during his coding-induced breakdowns. He recalled their most recent encounter, only a week prior. Knock, knock, knock. He'd opened the door to her smiling face, a foil-covered plate held aloft. "Mark, dear," she'd murmured, her voice a soothing cadence, "you seem to need a little boost. Chocolate chip, your favorite. I snuck in extra walnuts, just the way you like them." The aroma, warm and infused with sugar, drifted into the room. He'd expressed his gratitude, accepted the offering, and retreated into his digital world, the cookies a momentary solace. The memory now felt like a violation, a breach of trust. The image of Mrs. Gable, framed in his doorway with that expression, seared itself into his memory. Every shred of rationale he'd grasped for, mass paranoia, an outlandish prank, hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, dissolved into nothing. This wasn't a random occurrence, this was pointed. He advanced through the remaining recording, the figure remained frozen, unmoving, for an age, then turned its head, with deliberate slowness, to meet the camera's gaze. Despite the imperfect picture quality, Mark felt the palpable weight of that stare. A frigid dread unfurled itself in his stomach, a constriction tighter than any he had ever experienced. He was profoundly isolated. He couldn't involve the authorities, not with evidence so bizarre. He couldn't confide in anyone, they'd dismiss him as delusional. The welcoming faces of his neighbors, the predictable cadence of his routine, had transformed into a source of immeasurable dread. Every smile, every gesture of kindness, now carried a menacing edge. He switched off the machine, the sudden hush amplifying the frantic drumbeat of his heart. The apartment felt claustrophobic, the shadows deepening into tangible shapes. He peered through the window, the street lay dormant, the houses shrouded in darkness. But in his heart, he knew, they were waiting, lurking just beyond his sight, smiling. The sound of silence. The dial tone screamed in Mark's ear, a shrill counterpoint to the suffocating silence that had become his constant companion. He slammed the phone down. Mom hadn't even let him finish. Stress, she diagnosed, her voice thick with that practiced maternal concern that always felt more patronizing than comforting. You need to get out more, Mark. Stop staring at that computer screen. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. Last night, he'd seen Mrs. Henderson, the sweet old lady who lived across the street, standing on his lawn, smiling, that awful, stretching smile. He'd nearly jumped out of his skin. Next, he tried Liam, his best friend since kindergarten. Liam, the rock, the voice of reason. Surely, he'd listen. After a drawn-out explanation, punctuated by Mark's increasingly frantic tone, Liam chuckled. Dude, lay off the caffeine, sounds like you're having some killer nightmares. You need a vacation, not a tinfoil hat. Mark felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he was seeing. He tried to explain the vacant eyes, the unnatural stillness, the way the smile seemed to vibrate with something dark and wrong, but the words just wouldn't form properly, wouldn't convey the sheer terror that gripped him. Desperate, he scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name he hadn't spoken to in years. Detective Isabella Diaz. They'd gone to high school together. He remembered her as sharp, observant, someone who wouldn't dismiss him out of hand. He found her number listed under emergency contacts from a long-ago coding project. Why was she there? He didn't know. It didn't matter. He pressed dial. The phone rang 4 times before a voice, weary but alert, answered. Diaz. Detective Diaz, it's Mark Ashton. I don't know if you remember me. There was a pause. Ashton, from Northwood High, the computer guy. Yeah, that's me. Look, I know this is going to sound insane, but I need your help. He plunged into his explanation, stumbling over his words, trying to paint a picture of the encroaching horror. The silence on the other end was heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was professional, cool. So, you're seeing people with exaggerated smiles just standing around? Yes, it started a week ago, and they're getting closer. Last night, one was on my lawn. I think they're watching me. He heard the distinct rustle of papers. Mr. Ashton, are you currently under the influence of any substances? Mark clenched his jaw. No, I swear I'm completely sober. This is real, detective. I know it sounds crazy, but please, just hear me out. Something is happening. Diaz sighed, a sound that conveyed years of dealing with crackpots and conspiracy theorists. Look, Mr. Ashton, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm swamped with real cases. Maybe you should consider talking to a therapist. But what if it's not just me? What if others are seeing them too? There was another pause, longer this time. He could almost feel her skepticism radiating through the phone line. Finally, she said, all right, Mr. Ashton, tell me your address. I'll swing by tomorrow. But if I find so much as a whiff of anything illegal, or if this turns out to be a prank. The threat hung unspoken in the air. Mark swallowed, a sliver of hope flickering in the oppressive darkness. Thank you, detective, thank you. He gave her the address, then hung up, the silence in his apartment suddenly feeling less like a confrontation. Mark gripped the baseball bat, its cool steel a meager comfort in his sweaty grip, the wood felt substantial, a dependable weight against the creeping dread in his stomach that I and the window's reflection. A haggard stranger stared back, haunted by sleeplessness and etched with desperation that he looked like he hadn't known rest in weeks, a grim truth that he tightened his hold, knuckles bone white, tonight. It ended that he slipped from the house, the porch protesting with a mournful creak under his weight. The street lay hushed, drenched in the streetlight's eerie luminescence. Then he saw them. They stood at the edge of his drive, barring his way. A dozen figures, maybe more, their faces upturned, each sporting an unnerving, stretched grin. He recognized Mrs. Henderson from next door, her kind face twisted into that grotesque mimicry of a smile. Beside her stood Mr. Davies, the postman, his mailbag abandoned on the pavement. Even gentle Evie Hayes was present, her eyes glazed and fixed upon him. A tidal wave of rage washed over his fear. With a primal roar, he charged, swinging the bat towards Mr. Davies' shins. The impact was a sickening thud, yet Davies remained unmoved, the rictus smile unwavering. He seemed impervious to pain. Mark staggered back, the blow sending a jolt up his arm. He swung again, targeting Mrs. Henderson this time. Identical result. The smilers advanced, a silent, encroaching wave. He was encircled, imprisoned within a ring of grinning faces. The air thickened, saturated with a sickly sweetness that churned his gut. Then Mrs. Gable glided forward, her smile the widest, most unnerving of all. Her voice, usually a mellow alto, emerged as a warped, sugary cadence. "Mark, dear boy," she crooned, her eyes gleaming in the stark light. "Why fight it? We only want to share the delight. Join us. It's so much simpler." Her words hung in the air, a poisoned confection. He glanced at Evie, her expression fixed in that ghastly smile. This was wrong, fundamentally, utterly wrong. But seeing Evie like this, untouched by pain, impervious to the force of the bat, a stark realization dawned. This was no mere fight. This wasn't something he could solve with a Louisville slugger. This was something other, something beyond his comprehension. He let the bat fall, its weight suddenly oppressive. The will to resist had seeped away, breaking the pattern. The cold seeped through Mark's thin jacket. He backed against the damp brick wall, the rough texture digging into his spine. They were closer now, a semicircle of fixed, gruesome grins blocking the alley entrance. Evie's house was just across the street, but the smilers formed an impenetrable barrier. He was trapped. Panic clawed at his throat. He needed to think, to remember something, anything. The forum, the blurry image someone had posted, dismissed as conspiracy nonsense, something about angles. He risked a glance. Fear made his vision swim, but he forced himself to focus. There were 7 of them, spaced with unnatural precision, not random, deliberate. A pattern. It wasn't a straight line, or a perfect curve. It was geometric. A distorted hexagon, with him at the center. He remembered the forum post, a frantic rant about sacred geometry and disrupting the ley lines of the smiling ones. Nonsense, he'd thought then. Now, it was all he had. Scrabbling on the ground, he found a jagged piece of broken concrete. It was small, barely bigger than his fist, but it felt heavy, purposeful. He gauged the distance to the closest smiler, a woman with Evie's familiar, floral dress twisted into something grotesque. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a split second. He pictured the hexagon, the angles. Then, he hurled the rock. It struck the woman in the chest, a dull thud echoing in the silent alley. Her smile didn't falter, but something shifted. The entire formation rippled, like a reflection on disturbed water. A collective hiss, a sound like escaping steam, filled the air. They recoiled, taking a half-step back, the perfect angles dissolving into a confused jumble. Mark didn't wait. He bolted, sprinting across the street, ignoring the searing pain in his lungs. He hammered on Evie's door, the wood vibrating under his desperate blows. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. He risked a look back. The smilers were still there, clustered at the alley entrance, their smiles no longer uniform, no longer perfect. They seemed disoriented, confused. Headlights flashed, bathing the scene in stark white light. A police cruiser screeched to a halt, and Detective Diaz emerged, her face grim. She took in the scene, Mark panting on Evie's porch, the cluster of unsettling figures in the alley, the palpable tension hanging in the air. "Ashton," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "What in God's name is going on here?" She scanned the alley, her eyes narrowing as she took in the disturbed arrangement of figures. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just another random sighting, this felt different, worse. Diaz noticed the broken piece of concrete on the ground, a small dark stain blooming on the floral print dress of one of the figures. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat that he could only point, his hand trembling. Towards the alley in the fading, fractured smiles, the nightmare continues. The spray can spat, a crimson torrent erupting against the brick. Mark choked, the pungent fumes assaulting his senses, yet his hand remained steady. He worked with fervent haste, mirroring the erratic, almost fractured lines he'd witnessed emanating from the Smilers. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to combat the bizarre with something equally volatile. Reason, usually his guiding voice, had been silenced, replaced by an urgent drive to disrupt. Crimson overlapped existing tags, birthing a vibrant chaos of conflicting hues and skewed forms. He envisioned the Smilers flinching from the visual onslaught, their unsettling cohesion fracturing. When finished, the alley resembled a shattered monitor, a digital anomaly bleeding into reality. He stilled, expectant, the drone of crickets and distant city noises amplified, each ping a sharp jab, then, a wavering, a delicate shimmer at the alley mouth. The sight of previous encounters, the warped figures, those smiles stretched beyond human capacity, wavered, their edges fraying. One faltered, as if stumbling on unstable ground, then another, and another, like a corrupted download. They dissolved into digital snow, fading into the encroaching dark. Mark sagged against the wall, the spent spray can rolling away. Relief surged, swiftly followed by debilitating weariness. A victory, perhaps, but it felt fleeting. A brief reprieve before the inevitable return. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his veins, that they would adapt. He needed comprehension to unlock their code, their design, their motivation. He would dedicate himself, trading sleep, sanity, anything demanded. He re-entered his apartment, a faint chemical tang clinging to his clothes. The familiar glow of his monitor offered scant solace in the deepening gloom. His true toil, he understood, had only just begun. Detective Diaz reviewed the pixelated security footage, her expression grim. Another call about persons acting strangely near Ashton's residence. The vague descriptions, the persistent motif of unnaturally broad smiles. It was too peculiar to dismiss out of hand. Her initial thought had been mass delusion, or some viral stunt spiraling out of control. However, the naked dread reflected in Ashton's eyes during questioning, so intense, so genuine, lingered. And the witness accounts, though inconsistent and often bizarre, shared a unifying element, an unnerving composure, an almost artificial quality about the individuals. She magnified one of the figures in the frame. The image was blurred, nearly indecipherable, yet something about the angle of the jaw, the grotesquely elongated lips, a faint echo of familiarity. She ran it through facial recognition software. Negative. Damn, she sighed. Rubbing her fatigued eyes, she knew Miller, her partner, considered it a fool's errand, chasing phantoms. But Izzy harbored a visceral feeling about this, a nagging disquiet that refused to be ignored. She reopened Ashton's case file, revisiting his statement that it bordered on delusional, a jumble of patterns and glitches. But perhaps, concealed beneath the veneer of apparent madness, lay a sliver of truth. Reaching for her phone, Izzy's gaze hardened with resolve. She needed to inspect the alley Ashton had described, the one he claimed to have remedied. She would decipher the pattern, or its absence, firsthand. It was time to get down in the dirt.